The stench of decaying flesh was so intense that even the most seasoned courtiers were driven to vomit in the presence of royalty. Meanwhile, dogs eagerly licked at the fluids that seeped from King Henry VIII's coffin. Within moments, you will be confronted with shocking medical evidence that reveals how Henry VIII transformed from a golden prince into a grotesque figure, a revelation that historians would prefer to keep hidden. This evidence comes from newly examined records of court physicians and a forensic analysis of his remains, shedding light on a significant chapter of history that has largely been overlooked. Let us rewind and explore how England's most powerful king fell into this horrifying decline. What you are about to discover will alter everything you think you know about the Tudor dynasty. The man who executed two of his wives and fundamentally altered the religion of an entire nation met his end in an undignified manner that his government meticulously covered up for 450 years. However, recently uncovered medical records finally reveal the shocking truth, which begins with a fateful jousting accident that would lead to a slow rot within his body. On January 24, 1536, at Greenwich Palace, Henry VIII, still relatively fit at 44 years of age, charged across the tiltyard on his massive warhorse. The crowd held its breath as England's king aimed his lance at his opponent. The afternoon sun glinted off his specially tailored armor, each piece worth more than a common laborer could earn in a lifetime. But catastrophe struck when the horses collided, the force resembling a modern car crash. Henry's armored body, 300 pounds of man and metal, crashed to the frozen ground, and the moment hung in the air. Silence enveloped the tiltyard as onlookers stood paralyzed with fear, wondering if England had just lost its monarch to an extravagant sport. For 2 long hours, Henry lay unconscious, leaving England without a king, while Anne Boleyn, pregnant and hoping for a male heir, awaited news with anxiety. When Henry finally regained consciousness, witnesses noted a troubling change in him. The king's once bright, intelligent eyes now carried a darker, unpredictable light. His first words were not of relief or concern for his subjects. Rather, he erupted in fury, demanding to know why the tournament had been halted. The Renaissance prince, known for his charm, wit, and intellect, had seemingly vanished, replaced by a paranoid tyrant whose violent mood swings would come to terrorize England for the next 11 years. Modern neuroscientists studying historical accounts believe that Henry suffered a traumatic brain injury to his frontal lobe, the area of the brain that governs personality and impulse control. The evidence is compelling. Prior to the accident, Henry had exercised remarkable restraint for a monarch of his era, remaining married to Catherine of Aragon for over 20 years before seeking an annulment and executing relatively few nobles compared to his predecessors. However, after January 1536, the tide turned dramatically. By May, just 4 months later, Anne Boleyn had lost her head, and Thomas Cromwell, Henry's most trusted advisor, found himself ensnared in the king's increasingly erratic behavior. But the brain injury was only the initial horror of Henry's medical decline. The same accident that scrambled his personality also reopened a previous leg wound, one that would never heal. This is where our narrative shifts from tragedy to abject horror. Most people are unaware that Henry had sustained a leg injury years before, likely from another jousting accident. It had long since healed, leaving only a small scar, but the trauma from 1536 reopened that wound, exposing him to infection in a Tudor world where antibiotics and understanding of germ theory were non-existent. Imagine living with open sores the size of tennis balls on both legs for 11 years, constantly oozing pus that would never fully scab over. The agony was so intense that even the softest touch of silk bedsheets would drive him to screams of pain. The court physician, Dr. Thomas Vickers' secret notes, hidden in the Royal College of Physicians and only revealed in the 1960s, described agonizing ulcers so foul and painful that they could hardly be comprehended. Daily, Henry's legs had to be drained, with servants filling bronze bowls with infected fluids, swiftly removing the unpleasant evidence from royal presence. In his vanity and paranoia, Henry attempted to mask the deterioration of his condition, creating makeshift gutters lined with lead weights to compress his wounds, mistakenly believing this would facilitate healing. Instead, the pressure worsened his condition, cutting off circulation and exacerbating the infections. He drenched himself in expensive perfumes from Arabia, hoping to mask the odor of decay, even insisting that his portrait painters depict him with impossibly strong, athletic legs of facade for the entire kingdom. Yet those infections spread beyond his legs, poisoning his bloodstream. Each day, toxic byproducts from the rotting tissue seeped into his circulation, affecting his brain, liver, and heart. Modern medical analysis aligns with historical accounts, suggesting that Henry likely developed chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection that sends a stream of bacteria and inflammatory compounds throughout the body. The result was a cascade of symptoms that transformed his life into a living hell. The relentless pain in his legs would have been excruciating, akin to the worst toothache imaginable, but enduring non-stop for over a decade. Episodes of fever left him drenched in sweat one day and shivering the next, while his appetite fluctuated from inescapable nausea to ravenous hunger. Most devastating were the neurological effects. The toxins crossing into his brain would trigger violent mood swings independent of any situational provocation. One moment he might laugh at a jest, while the next he would order the jester's execution. Paranoia gripped him with alarming intensity as he increasingly suspected his servants of poisoning him and believed his wives were committing infidelities. By 1540, just 4 years post-accident, Henry had executed his second wife and annulled his marriage to a third, already seeking a fourth. His new target caught his eye, the young Catherine Howard, a girl of merely 17 years, juxtaposed against his 50. The contrast was grotesque. A king so corpulent he required assistance to mount his horse, pursuing a teenager reportedly repulsed by his advances. As the years dragged on, Henry's ulcers deteriorated further, particularly evident by 1542. When documented descriptions indicated a change in the appearance and odor of the discharges, once yellowish-white, now tinged with green and brown, evoking the very smell of death. His weight soared out of control, ballooning from an already substantial 180 pounds to over 350 as he could no longer exercise due to the pain in his legs. His 1540 armor was preserved, revealing a 48-inch waist, and by 1545, new armor had to be commissioned to accommodate a 54-inch waist larger than many modern. The palace itself required modifications to accommodate the king's growing girth. Doorways were widened, the floors reinforced, and special furniture crafted to allow for his enormous size. Henry's daily routine morphed into an elaborate performance to conceal his rapid decline. He would be dressed in bed, a process involving for servants, then hoisted into a wheeled chair concealed from public view. I have 2 more shocking revelations about his ultimate demise and the government cover-up that followed, but first, ensure you're subscribed, as I will unravel a series of Tudor conspiracies that historians would rather keep hidden. The physical transformation was matched by an equally disturbing mental decline. By 1544, courtiers noted Henry's behavior crossed into the realms of madness. Reports emerged of him holding conversations with invisible figures and arguing with the specters of those long dead, including his mother and even his executed wives. His paranoia reached extraordinary levels. He grew convinced that servants were conspiring against him, believing they were poisoning his food. Disturbingly, he began to order the execution of those he had already dispatched years prior, forgetting the very crimes he had perpetrated. One particularly chilling episode occurred during a state banquet in November 1546, during which he rose from his chair, an arduous task for which he required several servants only to scream at an empty chair, believing he was confronting Anne Boleyn's ghost. As January 1547 arrived, Henry VIII entered the final stages of his grotesque decline. What followed is so unsettling that historical records regarding his demise were suppressed for centuries. The ulcers on his legs had morphed into unimaginable horrors. Dr. Thomas Wendy, in his concealed medical notes, described wounds that exposed bone surrounded by blackened flesh indicating gangrene. The stench was unbearable, and windows had to be opened, even in the frigid January air, to combat the miasma of decay that filled any enclosed space. Henry's body had devolved into a putrid state. His skin took on a nauseating yellow hue, a clear indicator of liver failure, with his eyes growing yellow and bloodshot, sunk in discolored flesh. His speech became a wet rasp nearly impossible to understand, while his breath carried the potent odor of rotting meat, an odorous testament to his decay. Henry VIII's decline was not just a personal tragedy, but a national one, as even his government sought to conceal the horror that had gripped the once mighty monarch. The legacy of his grotesque transformation serves as a chilling reminder of the consequences of unchecked power, how the king who once dominated England became a shadow of his former self, both physically and mentally ravaged by the very power he wielded.